This GR Supra chassis has come so far from where it was. In fact, it's basically repaired, but there's a lot of rust prevention that we need to do. That being said, I don't even know if this engine's good, and I definitely don't know if my turbo is okay. That's right, after months of repairing this GR Supra chassis, I still haven't even figured out if this engine is good or repairable. See, this engine sat with a giant hole in the valve cover for 3 years, collecting water and rust. And if we look at the inlet of the turbo, we can see a little bit of a chip in the blades. First, if you're just joining us on the Supra build, let me catch you up to speed. I bought this crumpled up GR Supra at auction, sight unseen, for $5,500. Then we removed all of the crash damage, pulled the engine, gutted the interior, cut off the damaged frame, disassembled the entire rear of the car. Then we cut off the entire uni side, welded on our new front frame pieces, and then in the last episode, we completed the frame repair by fixing the transmission mount, the drive shaft mount, and we welded on our new uni side. We really need to pray to the car gods here that I can repair this engine, because I've already been buying some parts for it. It may not look like a lot of parts, but I think it's $2,000 to $3,000 worth of parts there. And if we dig into this engine just to find out that I wasted $2,000 to $3,000, it's gonna make it even more painful when I have to spend even more money on a new engine or even more money repairing this one. That being said, we're not gonna find out until we dig in. We might as well get started by taking off our lift here and all of the wiring so I can get a better look. And if you've ever taken a car this far apart and you didn't take pictures, I bet you were kicking yourself the whole time you were reassembling it. Even though I'm 99% sure I already have all these photos, I'm gonna retake them and be safe.
Now that we got pictures of where everything roughly goes, we can start taking off this mess of wiring. My tip of the day with wire harnesses is to use a pick when you're unclipping the connectors. This is honestly the best advice I've gotten for working with wiring, and I'm happy to pass this on to you. Life-changing advice, some would say. There are 4 separate wiring harnesses for this B58. The first one I have here fared the worst in the accident and is hanging on by a thread or a wire. This harness is the green one in this diagram and has most of the sensors for running the engine. Things like the cam position sensor, high pressure fuel pump, wiring for the intake, and even the wastegate for the turbo. Some of the wiring harness is held to the engine with bolts, and even though I have pictures of where it all goes, I'm going to put the bolt back into the engine once the wiring is out of the way for safekeeping. The next wiring harness we have here is the harness that heads down to the transmission. That's the grayish tannish one in the diagram. 2 more harnesses to go here, and I have to say A+ to BMW for making these separate harnesses. In my case, I only have damage on one of the wiring harnesses, so it was nice to be able to replace just that one rather the entire thing. Saves me some money, and if I had to replace this harness while it was in the car, it would have saved me a lot of time too. Now, the second to last harness we have off is what I would call the accessory harness. That's the purple one. It runs to things like the AC compressor, alternator, and the knock sensors too. And I saved the easiest harness for last. This one on top, or the blue one in the diagram, runs the injectors and the coil packs.
All right, all of our wiring off, and honestly that cleaned up a lot of the clutter around the engine. Who would have thought that there's so much wiring on these BMWs? I say we keep going on the intake side of things here, and let's start getting off our front accessories.
Starting off with the AC compressor. The AC compressor itself may be working internally, but the pulley was obliterated. And since I can't guarantee it works to begin with, I just bought a used one. You can also see here that the mounting location is broken too. I had to pry it off with a pry bar. Next up, taking off the belt tensioner. The tensioner itself is probably okay, but the pulley is very rough to spin, and it would probably make a lot of noise. Then 2 bolts for the alternator here. This one also a little difficult to pull off, but I think the alternator itself is good to go, so I'll be reusing this.
And you can see the mounting for the AC compressor and the alternator are both broken, and this whole assembly here is actually the water pump. So if you're ever in a major wreck with your B58, you're gonna probably have to replace your water pump just for the fact that your alternator and your AC compressor bolt to it. Not that that matters for us anyway, obviously the water pump itself was broken too.
Now to take off the water pump, we have to disconnect this hose that attaches to it and the block. Then the water pump bolts to the side of the block, and I wasn't sure how this plastic tube on the back disconnects, so it's coming off with it.
And that's the water pump off. And just like that, we got our accessories off. We have our tensioner, our water pump, alternator, and our AC compressor. I've replaced all of them except for the alternator. Hopefully that's okay. And here we are again, looking at an even cleaner B58. All that's really left for the intake side is an oil cooler, an oil filter, and a couple water pumps. I guess I don't know what this is called technically. It has a lot of coolant going through it. That's very obvious. I don't know if it's a pump or some sort of flow control to decide where stuff goes. If you do know, let me know in the comments. But for sure, the one on the bottom is an accessory water pump, just like this one on the front here. The one on the front comes from or goes to the turbo. I'm not sure which way. What I do know is that the coolant system is pretty complex. It's got to keep the turbo cool, it's got to keep the block cool, and it has to keep the intake cool because there's no air-to-air intercooler on the front like most cars. We have an air-to-water intercooler on this engine. On newer cars that have air-to-water, it's the coolant that cools down the charged air. On older cars, it has an air-to-air intercooler that works similar to a car's radiator. The air coming through the front of the car cools down the charged air because colder air is more dense, more oxygen, more power. If you've ever talked to a guy with a turbocharged vehicle and they say something like boost weather because it's cold outside, technically you make more power the colder it is outside because cold air is more dense. Now it looks like it should be pretty easy to disassemble the rest of the intake side. Looks like we have 3 pieces and they're all separate. We have an auxiliary water pump, and I know you guys will help me out and tell me what this is in the comments. And then we have our oil filter and oil cooling system here. And then of course we got these 2 brackets. These 2 brackets are here to hold up the intake. Since the intake is full of coolant, it's pretty heavy, so we have some extra bracing for that. Let's start by getting these brackets out of the way. Now we gotta remember to stop and take a picture before we keep going too fast here. There's only 3 items, but we gotta be safe rather than sorry. Ooh, yeah, more coolant. You know, I'm taking a guess here and saying that this is our thermostat. I don't know if it's an electric thermostat rather than a mechanical one, but I'm betting it decides when coolant flows out of the engine and to our front radiators. That's my guess, but I'm relying on you guys to tell me if I'm right there. And then lastly over here, we can just take off our motor mount. And that leaves us with our super clean intake side. I mean, a little dirty. I got some stuff to clean up. If you were here for the last series on the $1,000 BMW F10 build, you would know that I'm very happy that I don't have to do an extreme cleaning session on this engine block like I did the last one.
Which just leaves us with the hot side of the engine. Believe it or not, they call the side of the engine with the exhaust the hot side because the exhaust manifold gets really hot. Engine manifolds can be around 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 260 degrees Celsius, and can see temperatures in the thousands of degrees Fahrenheit if the engine is being pushed really hard. So you should strive to never touch one unless you're very sure it's not hot. Lucky for us, there is a lot less going on this side of the engine, so taking off the turbo is super easy. If you haven't seen this before, it might surprise you, but the turbo and the exhaust manifold are actually one unit. So if you want to take off your turbo, the whole thing has to come off together. However, a nice thing BMW did here is that the bottom bolts actually hold on a bracket that the turbo manifold sits on, meaning you only have to take off the top bolts and then it just slides off the bracket, which also makes it super easy to install since you just slide it on and it holds itself to the engine. Another thing you have to watch for is the oil and coolant lines. It's definitely easier to remove the lines from the block and leave them connected to the turbo. Lastly, there is a bracket on the bottom of the turbo to help support its weight that needs to be removed too.
And that's our turbo off too. Another round of applause for this bar right here from BMW, being able to slide on the bottom, and this will hold the bottom on so you can get everything else in place. This has been a nice engine to work on so far. And the last thing on the hot side of the engine. Okay, I said last thing, but I actually want to take off this heat shield and this hose just so I can inspect everything. I just really wanted to make sure that there was no giant hole in the block behind that heat shield, because that would have been devastating to find out later when we put the car back together.
Now moving on to the top side of the engine, I'm just going to quickly vacuum to try and prevent some of this debris from falling into the head. Then we can take off our fuel lines, high pressure fuel pump, and our fuel rails, exposing our injectors. These direct injection injectors are press fit into the head, so we'll be using a slide hammer to take them out. I bought this slide hammer during the $1,000 BMW F10 build, and it has different adapters to work with these B58 injectors too. You just slide the tool on, turn it 90 degrees to the right, and it locks into place. Then I start gentle and work my way up in power. I want to use the least amount of power possible just to be safe and not break the injectors. As I'm taking the injectors out, I'm labeling them 1 through 6 to match the cylinder they came out of so I can put them right back into the same spot. Now, one thing I'm not liking about this slide hammer is that the bolt keeps getting stuck in the actual slide. So I just found a washer that fits to prevent that. You may also notice that the injectors look really wet. That's just the fuel that was left in the fuel rail. So when I took it off, it all drained out onto the injectors. And with the injectors out, we can take off our valve cover.
Woo, there we go. Now, unveiling our head. Bada bing, you know, not bad. Not bad at all. All right, so here is the top of our head. Here is our valve train. We have our exhaust camshaft, our intake camshaft. And then on the N55, this was called the eccentric shaft. So I'm gonna go ahead and assume this is called the same thing. The eccentric shaft is how they can change how the intake valves are working. This electric motor moves this gear, which moves this shaft, which moves these rollers. The springs hold it all tight, and they can modify the intake timing, duration, and lift. They can't really control all three separately, but if they move this, it's definitely gonna modify all three of them. So while the intake side is complicated so that they can get maximum power and maximum fuel efficiency, the exhaust side is really standard. The timing chain turns the exhaust cam gear or cam phaser, which turns the camshaft, which pushes and opens the valves, letting the exhaust gas out. The last thing on the exhaust side is this big hunk of metal, and you can see that giant lobe. I mean, comparing that lobe to the lobes that actuate the lifters, that lobe's huge. If you look at our high pressure fuel pump, you'll see something that resembles a valve and a lifter, and that goes in that hole. That high pressure fuel pump sits in that mount and is actuated by that giant lobe there. And that pumping is what gets us our high pressure for our direct injection. Now, I don't know the specifics of what fuel pressure the B58 is at, but pretty standard for an American muscle car is about 60 PSI base pressure with no boost. And then usually for JDM cars, it's around 43 PSI. Now with direct injection and that high pressure fuel pump, it can be in the thousands, like 3, 4, 5,000 PSI. The reason you want that higher pressure, it atomizes the fuel better, giving you a better air-fuel mixture, giving you better and a more even combustion. The only other thing that really stands out to me is you can see the front of the engine here, but the gears are on the back. Meaning, if you want to do the timing chain on a B58, the engine's got to come out. Now I'll look into how much a timing chain is for the B58, and I'll do if it's cheap, but honestly it's probably just a waste of money. Remember, our Supra here and our engine only have 3,100 miles on them. So again, kind of a waste of money to do anything to this engine that I don't need to. Now at this point, I'm at a huge crossroads for this engine build. Part of me wants to keep the head on and only replace the exhaust camshaft. That's really the only thing broken on here. And the other half of me wants to tear the head off and inspect the cylinder walls and the pistons. The reason why I'm hesitating on that is, again, money. If I decide to take the head off, I need to get a new head gasket and I need to get new head bolts. And that's just gonna be another $300 to $500 that I don't wanna spend. Actually, like 5 minutes later, I've answered my own question. We are gonna take the head off. Here's what decided that for me is I have to take the exhaust camshaft off. The exhaust camshaft is bent on the tip from the accident. I already bought a brand new exhaust camshaft. And in order to replace the exhaust camshaft, I have to take off the exhaust cam gear, which probably means I have to take off the timing chain. And if I take off the timing chain, well, I can just leave the intake side put together and just lift the head off. So next up, we're gonna take the head off. But first, I wanna make sure I know how to time this engine so I can visually see on a factory engine that it's timed correctly and what to look for and where everything should be. And it's a good thing I did that because I'm actually surprised on one thing on this engine. See, normally when I'm disassembling an engine, I would take the oil pan off before I take the head off. But in the case of the B58, the way you make sure you're in time on the B58 requires the oil pan to be on. So in order for me to time the engine, the oil pan has to be on because the oil pan has this hole here. And here's the tool that you insert into this hole, which slides into the flex plate to make sure that your crankshaft is perfectly timed. Okay, so that's how you time the crankshaft, but that doesn't guarantee that the camshafts are in time. So if we take a look at our exhaust camshaft, there's supposed to be some writing on the top of the camshaft here, and the fact that we don't see it means that our crankshaft is in time, but our camshafts are not.
The reason that the crankshaft is in time and the camshafts are not is because the camshafts spin once every time the crankshaft spins twice. So I just need to rotate the crankshaft another full rotation to get everything in time.
So now you can see I spun the crankshaft another 360 degrees, and we have writing on top of our camshaft on the intake side too, meaning our camshafts are in time. And I can slide our crankshaft timing tool in, and now our B58 is perfectly in time.
Now we can use this tool to lock the camshafts in place. That way when we remove the cam gears, the camshafts don't spin out of time. Then we can remove the timing chain tensioner, then use this special socket that comes in the B58 timing toolkit to remove our Vanos valves that also double as the bolt for the cam gears. After the Vanos valves are out, the cam gears just slide off. Then we can remove this top chain guide and we'll be ready to remove the head bolts. There are 5 smaller bolts around the timing chain that aren't torqued down too hard. I missed the one in the middle here, but I just came back for it later. Now onto the big boy bolts. I'm breaking them loose with the breaker bar first, then I can just come back around and zip them out with the impact. I have a bigger impact that I know could do the job, it's just not worth the risk of breaking a bolt or the socket, so I recommend breaking them loose by hand.
Okay, took the bolts out. Hopefully this comes out easier. There we go. Woo. All right, we have our B58 short block. Short block just means that it doesn't have the head on it, basically. If you have the heads on, it's called a long block. Definitely glad that I tore this apart. I mean, you can see how dirty it is. I don't know how much of this is carbon buildup versus sand and grit getting in here from when I tore it apart. But we get to clean the mating surface, we get to clean the heads. More importantly, we get to look at our cylinder walls and, oh God, it looks like the engine only has 3,000 miles on it. I'm stoked about that. That cross hatching is sexy. I don't see any issues in here. Definitely no cracks in the block. No holes in the side of the block. No holes in our pistons. I obviously didn't think it would, but you never know sometimes. Next up, I'm just gonna get some oil on the cylinder walls because they've been oilless for 3 years. Because the next thing I want to do is spin this over without the head. Now I'm going to get cylinders 1 and 6 to the bottom, and we can kind of clean up the top of these quick and lube up 1 and 6's cylinder walls. Now the chain is still in here, so you'll probably see this moving around a little bit, and any rattling or any weird noises you hear is most definitely just the chain, but I'll let you know if I think otherwise. All right, as I was spinning it, the timing chain was getting bound up. I think it's actually spun around down there. Everything spins over nicely. So finally, we can spin this over and dump a bunch of fluid on the ground. Nice. And oil, of course. Should have probably put a pan down to catch everything, but that's okay. So let's go ahead and take our oil pan off. All right, now with all the bolts out, there's 3 places around the oil pan for you to crack the seal, and it's on there pretty tight. Okay, sealant broke around there. Oh, there we go. Broken loose there. Broken loose here. And broken loose all the way around. And the oil pan should just come right off. Revealing, not our crankshaft yet, our windage tray. Oh my. Well, it's a good thing we took this off. All right, just a reminder, label your bolts, people. More importantly, it's very, very fortunate that we took this oil pan off because it's disgusting. It has a frothy mess at the bottom. I mean, look at this. This is not what oil is supposed to look like. I don't know if this is from sitting for 3 years or water mixing with it, but it's a good thing we took it apart so we can clean this mess. All right, now let's finally take off this windage tray and look at our crankshaft. Okay, so JK, in order to take the windage tray off, we have to take the oil pump off, which means we have to take the oil pump gear off. Now, it's really important to look up how to do stuff because in the case of this bolt, it's a left-handed thread, meaning if I just started cranking on it lefty-loosey, we would have broke it. But now that we know it's a left-handed thread and righty is actually loosey instead of lefty-loosey, it comes right off. There's a special tool that's supposed to be a really tight radius here so you can take this off. But if you have a really long Torx, you can go through the flywheel and not have to take it off. And that bolt's out and the gear is off. And I can put that bolt right back in so we don't lose the gear or the bolt. Now we can take off our oil pump. Woo-wee. You can hear the compression on that puppy. And that'll give us more room to work out the timing chain mess I made here. Big mistake on my end, I got the timing chain all wrapped around. Nothing's broken here, I didn't put a lot of pressure on it. As soon as I felt that it got tight and wasn't moving, I stopped. So we just have to untangle our chain. But all of that work to take the oil pump off was just for this one bolt to take the windage tray off. And that should be the windage tray, or whatchamacallit, and our crankshaft. Oh, God, it's beautiful. Now let me undo my timing chain mess here so we can crank her over and see how it looks. There we go. Okay. Timing is no longer tangled. Let's give her some spins. Smooth. Again, the rattling you hear is either my ratchet or the timing chain. And one more time from the top, now that the timing chain is unstuck. All right, it's time to start going through all these parts and seeing what's good, bad, what I need to order, and what I already have. Starting with the oil system, valve train, and basically everything needed to seal up the engine. From bottom to top, we have our oil pan. That's good, just needs to be clean. Windage tray is fine. Oil pump is fine. And then we get to our first problem child, our harmonic balancer. Originally, I thought this would be reusable. It's just scratched up from the accident. But if we actually look at it, it is bent. So unfortunately, harmonic balancer, bad, need a new one. Then we get to the top of the engine and we have our head. The head itself is fine. The intake is fine, although we do have some surface rust, but I'm very confident that I could just clean that up and we'll be good to go. Unfortunately though, the exhaust camshaft was bent in the accident, so I need a new exhaust camshaft. And of course I've taken the head off, so we need a new head gasket and new head bolts, which reminds me, for the oil pan, it doesn't have a gasket, but it is siliconed or RTV'd to seal, so we'll have to buy some of that to replace it. And then we come back up to the top, we have our cam phasers, cam gears, our Vano solenoids. Those are both good, or at least I have no reason to believe they're bad. And then we get to the tippity top and we have our broken valve cover. Obviously I need to replace that too. Oh, look at me, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I said the intake side is fine, but I forgot that the eccentric shaft motor or actuator is broken. We're gonna need a new one of those. And this bent up bracket, obviously gonna need to be replaced as well. Next up on the chopping block, we have our fuel system and our ignition system. I don't see any issues with the wiring and I don't see any issues with the coil pack, so we're good there. What I don't have is spark plugs, so I'll add that to the list. Coming over to the fuel system, I again have no reason to believe any of this is not working. Now we have our turbo and the cooling system. Now you may be wondering why I grouped the cooling system with the turbo, and it's just for this one hose and this pump here. This auxiliary pump that runs to or from the turbo, I'm not sure, is broken, and this hose that connects to it is also ripped. So I need to replace this coolant line and that auxiliary pump. Moving to the right, we have another auxiliary pump. The pump is fine and those hoses are fine. These two hoses are not okay. This water pump is really, really not okay. I think the water pump is one of the worst parts that I've taken off of this engine, where the AC bolts in is broke, alternator bolts in is broke, the pulley that drives the water pump is broke, and even this fitting here that connects to the coolant hose is broke. So this thing is absolutely destroyed. There's no saving it. Then we get to this doohickey. I've already asked you guys what this is. I'm not sure. I'm sure I'll find out soon. I think it's good. I think it's a futuristic thermostat. Rather than being controlled by just the temperature itself, there's wires and a pump controlling the flow. That's my best guess anyway, but I'm sure this is fine, but the hose that connects to it is ripped at the end. And lastly, I did clump our oil filter housing into the cooling system just because coolant does run through it. Next up, alternator, AC compressor, and our tensioner. The tensioner is bad, alternator is good, AC compressor is probably functional, but the pulley is broken. Real quickly, all of the heat shields, the exhaust clamp, the motor mounts, the intake brackets, these are all fine. Don't need to order anything here. Then we have these 4 vacuum lines and the part of the intake that bolts to the turbo. We are 0 for 5 on these pieces. I need to order all 4 of these vacuum lines and that piece of the intake. And last but not least, we have 3 wire harnesses that we need to make sure are good. And sadly, only 1 of the 3 is good. None of these connectors are broken. None of the sensors that they go to are broken. Unfortunately, this wire harness is very, very broken. And then the third one, well, I already bought a new one for it, even though it's fine. I actually tried to order this broken harness, ordered the wrong one, and then finally ordered the correct one. So these 2 harnesses are gonna get replaced. That harness is fine. We only have 1 sensor that I don't have, that I don't know what it is. And once we have all of those parts that we just discussed, we can put this back together, paint the chassis, reassemble it, and I desperately want to drive this thing. It's gonna be winter here, but I'm gonna drive it anyway. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.